Ghosts? Sure, they could be real. I'd read all the stories, heard the whispers growing up, and even had one or two unexplained experiences. But believing didn't mean I let it run my life. Most of the time, I pushed the thoughts aside, reasoning that if I hadn't been seriously haunted by now, I probably wouldn't be. That said, I wasn't the kind of guy to purposely seek trouble either. I wouldn't mess with Ouija boards or go ghost hunting in graveyards. You respect the unknown, and the unknown respects you. At least that was the balance I'd always maintained. But the night I checked into the Wayward Hotel, that's when my balance tipped. That's when I learned what it truly meant to believe in things you can't explain. It started with a simple business trip. The company I worked for was sending me across state lines for some dull training seminar. I wasn't thrilled about it, but the money was good, and I could use the networking. I booked a last-minute room in a town I'd never heard of. All the usual hotels were full due to some local festival, so I had to dig deeper into the internet's abyss to find something with vacancy. I found the Wayward Hotel. There wasn't much information about it. Barely any reviews, just a few blurry photos of a building that seemed to have been stuck in a time warp. It was old, charming in a way, and according to the map, only a 15-minute drive from the office I'd be at the next day. Convenient, cheap, and, if I'm being honest, the eerie vibe it gave off intrigued me a little. When I arrived, the first thing that hit me was how isolated it was. The GPS had taken me through a web of increasingly narrow streets, leading me farther away from anything resembling civilization. I'd passed by fields, empty lots, and rows of houses that looked abandoned. By the time I pulled into the small gravel lot in front of the hotel, it felt like I'd stepped out of time, like I'd driven into another era. The building stood tall, 3 stories high, its dark brick exterior faded and crumbling in places. Ivy snaked up one side, the sign above the entrance, the Wayward Hotel, flickering in weak, yellowish light. There were no other cars, no movement, just a heavy silence hanging in the cool evening air. That I should have turned around right then. But instead, I grabbed my overnight bag and headed inside. The lobby was just as unsettling as the exterior. It smelled faintly of must and damp wood, like the place hadn't been properly aired out in years. The wallpaper was a deep maroon, peeling in some spots, and the furniture, old antique pieces, looked untouched for decades. Behind the front desk stood the receptionist, a man who could have easily blended into the background if I wasn't looking for him. His frame was long and thin, like he'd been stretched out, and his pale skin had an almost waxy sheen to it. His eyes were dark, sunken into his gaunt face, and his smile, well, it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect in the hospitality business. "Checking in?" he asked, his voice soft but deliberate, like he was savoring each word. "Yeah, I have a reservation for one night," I replied, feeling a bit unnerved by the way his gaze lingered a little too long. I slid my ID across the desk, and he examined it with a slowness that only made my anxiety worse. "Room 307, he finally said, pulling an actual key from a drawer, one of those old-fashioned brass ones with a big tag on it. I took it, noticing the cool weight of it in my hand. "And," he continued, hesitating as if what he was about to say was important, "I need you to follow these." He reached beneath the counter and handed me a folded piece of paper. His fingers lingered on it for a moment before letting go, like he was reluctant to give it to me. I stared down at the paper, confused. "Follow what?" "The hotel rules," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Read them carefully. They're important." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I stood there for a second, unsure of whether this was some weird hotel gimmick or if I just stepped into something far worse than I'd imagined. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I unfolded the paper and skimmed over the list of rules. They were written in a neat, careful script. Old 2. The paper felt brittle, like it had been handled too many times. Hotel rules. 1. Do not, under any circumstances, leave your room between 12:13 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. 2. If you hear someone knocking on your door after midnight, ignore it. Do not open the door. Do not speak. Do not move. Point 3. If you wake up to the sound of crying, do not try to locate the source. Stay in bed, cover your ears if you must, but do not investigate. Point 4. At exactly 2:22 a.m., you may hear the sound of furniture being dragged down the hall. This is normal. Do not be alarmed. Point 5. If the phone rings after 1 a.m., do not answer it. The call is not for you. Point 6. Do not look out the windows after dark. If you happen to glance outside and see someone staring back at you, close the curtains immediately. Point 7. If you see a figure standing at the end of the hallway when you return to your room, return to the lobby and ask for a new key. Do not attempt to pass the figure. I laughed nervously, folding the paper back up. Is this for real? The receptionist didn't smile, didn't break character. Just follow the rules, sir. It's safer that way. Safer. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod. You'll be fine, as long as you follow the rules. I felt a cold trickle of unease slide down my spine. This wasn't a joke. At least not to him. The way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, made my skin crawl. Room 307, I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, the key still clutched in my hand. The ride was slow, the air in the elevator stifling, almost claustrophobic. The dim lighting overhead flickered every now and then, casting strange shadows against the metal walls. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a long, narrow hallway. It was unsettlingly quiet. The carpet, a dark red like the wallpaper in the lobby, muffled my footsteps as I made my way toward my room. The lights above me buzzed faintly, and I could hear the faint hum of the building settling, creaks, groans, and the occasional whisper of wind from outside. I reached room 307 and slid the brass key into the lock, hearing the satisfying click of the mechanism turning. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was sparse. Just a bed, a wooden nightstand, and a desk by the window. The curtains were drawn, and I found myself hesitating before approaching them. Rule 6. Don't look out the windows after dark. I shook off the thought. It was just a stupid set of rules. A gimmick, right? The hotel's way of trying to scare people. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down with a sigh. The mattress was stiff, and the whole room smelled faintly of dust and old wood. As I settled in, I glanced at the old-fashioned clock on the nightstand. 11:45 p.m. My eyes flicked back to the paper in my pocket, and I pulled it out again. The first rule flashed in my mind like a warning. Do not leave your room between 12:13 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. The rational part of my brain scoffed, but a deeper, quieter part of me couldn't shake the growing unease. There was something about this place. Something wrong. I told myself I'd just get some sleep, follow the rules, if only to ease my own paranoia, and get out first thing in the morning. Simple enough. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the air in the room grew heavier. I lay back on the stiff mattress, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the tension creeping up my spine. The sound of the ticking clock was all I could focus on, each second dragging by like a warning. 11:50 p.m. 11:55 p.m. The minutes crawled, the weight of the room pressing down on me like a slow suffocation. The rules nagged at the back of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all just an elaborate prank. Still, I found myself checking the lock on the door, making sure it was secure. 12:00 a.m. I glanced at the nightstand clock again, my heart beginning to pick up pace. The stillness of the room felt more oppressive now, like the air itself was thickening around me. I reached for the small, brittle piece of paper, unfolding it for what felt like the 100th time. My eyes landed on the first rule again. Do not, under any circumstances, leave your room between 12:13 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. I didn't know why I was so hung up on it. Maybe it was the eerie quiet of the hotel. Maybe it was the strange receptionist. Or maybe it was the fact that there wasn't a single sound in the building, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I decided I would follow the rule, just for peace of mind. It wouldn't hurt to be cautious. That I lay back on the bed, trying to relax, though every creak and groan of the old building made my nerves stand on edge. The clock clicked over to 12:10 a.m. 3 more minutes. That was when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes or maybe the wind outside. But no, it was deliberate. Someone or something was tapping against the wall outside my door. It was slow, steady, and growing louder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, trying to convince myself it was just another guest. But the hotel was dead silent. No other cars were in the lot, and who would be wandering the halls at this hour? 12:12 a.m. The tapping stopped suddenly, leaving behind a silence even more unnerving than the sound itself. I sat up, straining to hear anything else. My pulse quickened. The room seemed darker now, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. I couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting someone, to be standing on the other side. 12:13 a.m. I didn't move. I didn't dare leave the bed. My eyes flicked back to the clock as the second hand ticked past the minute. I was officially in the danger zone according to the hotel's bizarre rules. Then came the knock. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deliberate, loud enough to be unmistakable but not forceful. Just a slow, measured knocking. 3 times, then silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, adrenaline flooding my veins. Ignore it, I told myself, gripping the sheet so tightly my knuckles went white. Do not move. The rule was clear. If you hear someone knocking on your door after midnight, ignore it. Do not open the door. Do not speak. Do not move. I was frozen in place. It was as if the room had dropped 10 degrees, a chill crawling up my spine. My mind raced, thoughts running wild. Who was at the door? What if they needed help? What if it was someone else staying in the hotel? But then, deep down, I knew better. I knew this wasn't another guest. Knock, knock, knock. Another 3 knocks, the exact same pattern. Slow, deliberate. That I could feel the fear clawing at the back of my throat. A primal instinct telling me that whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. I had to keep still. I had to follow the rules. But my body screamed at me to do something. The silence stretched out again, thick and suffocating. I counted the seconds in my head, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then I heard it, a faint, soft whisper, just on the other side of the door. Too quiet to make out any words, but close enough that I could hear the hissing breath behind it. Someone, or something, was standing right outside my room, listening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The whispering grew louder, the sound more agitated, as if whatever was out there was getting impatient. The handle of the door rattled lightly, just for a second, as if it was testing to see if I'd left it unlocked that I had to focus. I had to block out the sounds. I couldn't respond, not a single sound. The knocking had stopped, but the whispering was relentless, growing louder, more frantic, like it was pushing against the barrier of the door, trying to seep through the cracks. My skin crawled with the sense that whatever was out there wasn't just waiting, it was expecting something, expecting me to break. Suddenly, the whispering stopped dead. My eyes flew open, every muscle in my body tense. The silence was deafening. I strained my ears, listening for any hint of movement. Then came the dragging sound. At first, it was faint, but soon I could hear the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor just outside my door. I remembered Rule 4.at exactly 2:22 a.m. You may hear the sound of furniture being dragged down the hall. This is normal. Do not be alarmed. I glanced at the clock. It wasn't 2:22 yet. It was barely past 12:30. The sound of dragging grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't like furniture being moved. It was slower, more methodical, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, savoring each scrape against the floor. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat there, paralyzed. The hotel rules were clear. This wasn't supposed to be happening yet. I quickly scanned the paper again, the words blurring in my vision as panic set in at exactly 2:22 a.m. But it wasn't 2:22. The clock blinked, mocking me. 12:34 a.m. I squeezed the paper so hard it crinkled in my hand. Something was wrong. Was I breaking a rule without knowing it? Was there something else I should have done? The dragging stopped. Silence again, but not the same oppressive silence as before. This was a waiting silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. My ears strained, listening for anything, any sign of movement, any indication of where it was. Then came the knock, but this time it wasn't at the door. Knock, knock, knock. It was behind me. At the window, I felt a wave of cold wash over me as dread settled in my stomach. Rule 6 came rushing back. Do not look out the windows after dark. If you happen to glance outside and see someone staring back at you, close the curtains immediately. I didn't want to turn around. Every fiber of my being told me to stay facing forward, to ignore it, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the curtains rustling softly. The window behind them was only partially closed, a small sliver of darkness peeking through. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks came again, this time louder, more insistent. I froze. The rule echoed in my head, almost screaming now. Do not look outside. But it was already too late. My eyes locked on the sliver of window still visible, and I saw it. A face pale, too pale, with impossibly large, black eyes that gleamed in the faint light of the room. It was pressed against the glass, its mouth twisted, razor-sharp teeth visible even in the darkness. But it wasn't the smile that terrified me. It was the way its eyes didn't blink, didn't move, as if they weren't looking at me but into me. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the curtains shut, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind torn between terror and disbelief. Suddenly, the face shifted. The smile widened, stretching impossibly far across its pale skin. Then, without warning, it banged its head against the glass. Bang! I jumped, the sound reverberating through the room. Bang! It slammed its head again, harder this time. The glass shook, but didn't crack. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, my fingers shaking so violently that I almost dropped the fabric. Bang! The head hit the glass once more, and I yanked the curtains closed, stumbling back onto the bed. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. The banging stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then,